Hello everyone. In today's lecture we will be exploring the reign of the penultimate Ottoman Sultan Abdülhamid II. The years of Abdülhamid's reign in the latter part of the 19th century are usually considered to be a time of reaction and stagnation in the empire by most historians. We discussed briefly in a previous lecture how Abdülhamid came to the throne in 1876 and helped to promulgate the constitution passed that year. Indeed, at first, Abdülhamid was celebrated by liberals who thought that he'd institute reforms. However, following the war with Russia, which we covered in the last lecture, this liberal reputation did not last long. The Ottoman Parliament, promised in the constitution, met only once in March 1877 before the war disrupted proceedings. In February 1878, after the war with Russia was concluded, the Sultan disbanded the constitution entirely and ruled the empire directly from his palace. Abdülhamid continued the process begun in the early 19th century of centralizing the Ottoman Empire. Infrastructure was a vital component of this. Railways and telegraph poles were constructed throughout the empire, often built using foreign investment and capital. In fact, many of the new railway lines were owned entirely by West Europeans and were run from London or Paris and later Berlin. The Ottoman Empire simply lacked wealthy investors with enough capital or access to credit to build the railways themselves. An exception to this was the Hejaz Railway, which was designed to run from Damascus to the Islamic holy cities on the Arabian Peninsula. Abdülhamid II called on all Muslims in the world to make donations to the construction of the railway, which thus became a religious symbol. Pilgrims on their way to the holy city of Mecca often didn't reach their destination, dying in the harsh conditions along the way. Abdülhamid was adamant that the railway become a symbol for Muslim power and solidarity. This rail line would make the religious pilgrimage easier, not only for Ottomans, but for all Muslims. In the end, shortages of labor and supplies meant that it was decided by Abdülhamid that the railway would only go so far as Medina, with construction finishing in 1908. Abdülhamid also greatly built up the power of the Ottoman secret police and spy system. The Sultan was an incredibly paranoid man, and his excessive concern for both foreign and domestic surveillance brought about new forms of intelligence gathering. Spies were tasked with issuing reports on their neighbors and on the general populace. They were encouraged, and in some cases required, to submit reports on as many citizens as possible. Patrols were issued in the border areas of the empire in order to collect evidence of goings-on there. Corruption became endemic with this enhanced surveillance, primarily because of the rewards that successful spies could receive from the Sultan. Individuals who contributed a great number of reports to Abdülhamid were deemed loyal and would achieve status and promotion. The reports that were being turned in, however, often were false or pertained to unimportant events. Innocent civilians were often subjugated to interrogation, while the informant reaped numerous benefits. Despite the Sultan's centralization of power and his paranoia, significant reforms were passed during his time in office. 18 professional schools and a plethora of libraries were opened throughout the empire. These educational reforms culminated in the renovation of Istanbul University in 1900. Particular focus was given to ensuring that military officers received the finest education in the land. Legal reforms were undertaken by the Sultan's advisor, Mehmed Said Pasha, who also transformed the civil service and consistently petitioned the Sultan to tackle the foreign influence in the country. As the years wore on, it proved harder and harder to keep the Ottoman Empire together. The island of Cyprus in the eastern Mediterranean had been conquered by the Ottomans in 1570. Nonetheless, the large landowners and local elites on the island were free from much of the oversight of Istanbul and had largely ignored the reforms of the last 50 years. Mostly, Cyprus was forgotten by the sultans as an unimportant backwater. There was thus not too much opposition when, after the Berlin Congress in 1878, the British occupied Cyprus and begun to rule the island themselves, supposedly on a lease from the Ottomans. The British justified their rule by saying that their presence on Cyprus would help to deter Russian attacks upon the Ottoman Empire. However, secretly, the British wished to control Cyprus as a way of expanding their own influence and allowing rapid attacks on the Suez Canal should one be required. In 1882, the British then expanded into Egypt and Sudan. The previous year, an Egyptian army officer and former peasant, Ahmed Urabi, mutinied and initiated a coup against the ruler of Egypt, Tewfik Pasha. Urabi's coup was a result of his resentment as to the level of influence that the UK and France had in Egypt. The British dispatched a fleet of warships to Alexandria in northern Egypt at the same time as an anti-Christian riot broke out in the town, resulting in numerous deaths. On the 11th of July 1882, Alexandria was bombarded for 10.5 hours straight by the British ships. After landing, the British pushed inland and routed Urabi's army at the Battle of Tel al-Kebir. British forces then pushed on to Cairo and announced that Tewfik Pasha was restored to his throne. Formally, the British did not control Egypt until 1914, but informally their influence in the country was secured thanks to a large military garrison of British troops which would remain in Egypt until the 1950s. Whilst Egypt fell under the control of the British, Tunisia, further to the west, became a colony of France. Tunisia, like Algeria, Egypt and Cyprus, enjoyed a large degree of autonomy from Istanbul, and the local leader, the Bey, was able to run affairs in the country largely as he wished. In the spring of 1881, raiders operating out of Ottoman Tunisia attacked a town in French Algeria. The French declared that they had the right of pursuit and counterattacked, conquering Tunisia over the course of the following year. The Bey remained in power, but the French now controlled all of Tunisia's financial and foreign affairs. This conquest was popular in France, being unanimously ratified in the Senate and with only one nay vote in the lower house, the Chamber of Deputies. The other European powers quietly acquiesced to the French conquest. Italy was outraged, seeing Tunisia as in its sphere of influence by virtue of geography, but it kept quiet so as not to risk war with France. The hostile actions of the British and the French led the Sultan to pursue an alliance with both countries' rival, Germany. The German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, became a frequent visitor to Istanbul. German army officers were tasked with improving and modernizing the Ottoman army, and even to lead troop divisions. In return for their aid, the Germans demanded financial compensation. In particular, Germany was interested in creating a railway from Berlin to Baghdad in order to link German industry back home to its colonies in Asia, as well as to the oil supplies of the region. This project would thus free Germany of its reliance on British shipping. Permission for the railway was granted in 1899 and work began in 1910, but the railway was far from completed by the time of the First World War, during which the British conquered Baghdad and incorporated Iraq into their own empire. Ottoman control in the Balkans, tenuous for the last 50 years, became almost impossible to maintain during Abdülhamid's reign. Eastern Rumelia, meant to be a buffer state between Bulgaria and Istanbul, fell to a Bulgarian coup in 1855, leaving Bulgarian soldiers a matter of miles from the Ottoman capital. Albanians, who were mostly Muslim, resented the loss of lands that they considered to be part of Albania to Montenegro, and accused the Sultan of being unable to protect them and their interests. The League of Prizren was formed by Albanian nationalists in 1878 in today's Kosovo. Here, Albanians promised to uphold the integrity of the empire if the empire in return worked to protect them and to restore the lands taken by the Montenegrins. The Sultan was at first supportive, but wanted the Albanians to affirm their loyalty as Ottomans first and as Albanians second. The League refused to do this, and then embarked on a conflict of its own with Montenegro without permission. In the face of international pressure, the Sultan dispatched a force to crush the League. This was accomplished in 1881 with the execution of the League's leaders and their families. As a way to resuscitate popular support and strengthen his position against enemies both inside and outside of the Ottoman Empire, Abdülhamid increasingly turned to Islamism for a solution. With the extinction of many independent Muslim states and their absorption into the empires of the European powers, the role of the Sultan as Caliph of Islam was exploited by Abdülhamid as a means of deterring European powers from pressing him too hard, lest he create dissension within their own territories. In addition, stress on popular Islam through the press and other publications, and through the Sultan's patronage of dervish orders, served to rally Muslim opinion within the empire behind him. The lands in the middle of the southern Balkans are known as Macedonia. Macedonia was without doubt the most multicultural of all the Ottoman possessions in Europe, having a mixed Albanian, Greek, Bulgarian, Serbian, and Turkish population. Following the restoration of Macedonia to the Ottomans from Bulgaria after the Congress of Berlin, the Sultan blocked repeated European attempts to force him to reform the province. In the meantime, Macedonia became a battleground between Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece, all of whom competed to win influence in the region. The three minor powers all competed to convert the Macedonian peasants to their cause by sending religious agents to spread their language, and also by investing economically in the area, particularly in the building of new schools. At the same time, a Macedonian separatist movement began very slowly to develop, which argued that Macedonians were neither Bulgarians, Serbs, or Greeks, and called for Macedonian independence. In 1893 Salonika, today part of Greece, Bulgarian revolutionaries founded the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, or VMRO, to work for the unification of Macedonia into Bulgaria. The motto of the VMRO was "Freedom or Death," and they took to the mountains and forests of Macedonia to wage a guerrilla war against the Ottomans. In some areas, the revolutionaries were so successful that the Ottoman state was able to exert no influence whatsoever. These regions became de facto independent, with their own administrations and even their own tax collectors. In 1903, VMRO launched an outright rebellion. Although this was crushed in a matter of months and the perpetrators executed, the rebellion led to concessions being granted to the Christians of Macedonia at the insistence of the great powers. VMRO then became a terrorist organization targeting many of the largest cities in the region for their attacks. Several conspiracies took place against Abdülhamid. In 1889, a conspiracy in the Military Medical College spread to other Istanbul colleges. The conspirators called themselves the Committee of Union and Progress and were commonly known as the Young Turks. When this plot was discovered, some of the leaders went abroad to Paris, Geneva, and Cairo, where they helped prepare the ground for revolution by developing a comprehensive critique of the Sultan. The Young Turks were not a unified group. At their 1902 Paris Congress, delegates split over whether to have a centralized or decentralized empire and whether or not to accept foreign assistance. The power of the Young Turks was also limited for as long as the army remained loyal to the Sultan. Revolution only came in 1908 as a result of the rebellion of the 3rd Army Corps stationed in Macedonia, where officers acted independently of the Young Turks in Paris. It is unclear if a coordinated conspiracy existed or if a number of separate centers of dissatisfaction, linked haphazardly through individuals, coalesced in July 1908 under the banner of the Young Turks through the pressure of events. On July 3, 1908, Major Ahmed Niazi advanced on Istanbul with 200 followers, including civilians, demanding the restoration of the constitution. His rebellion spread rapidly. Abdülhamid was unable to rely on other troops, and on July 24th he announced the return of the constitution. The young officers who had instigated the revolution were primarily concerned with preserving the Ottoman Empire. They feared that the Sultan's policies and European intervention were endangering its existence. Grievances concerning personal matters such as salary and rank also may have played a part. It is clear, however, that the officers had not fought much beyond their demand for the restoration of the constitution. They had no program of action and were content to leave governance to the established bureaucrats. In April 1909, however, an army mutiny in Istanbul exposed the weakness of the Young Turks and at the same time gave them a new opportunity. The mutiny resulted from the discontent of ordinary soldiers over their conditions and then their neglect by college-trained and politically ambitious officers. They were encouraged by a religious organization known as the Mohammedan Union. The weakness of the government allowed this mutiny to spread, and although order was eventually restored in Istanbul, a force from Macedonia, known as the Action Army, marched on the capital and occupied the city on April 24th. Abdülhamid was deposed and replaced by the weak Sultan Mehmed V. The constitution was amended to transfer real power to the parliament, and the army now became the strongest force in Ottoman politics.